Hey, I'm Bill from Ursa Vineyards, and I'm here today to have some fun in the kitchen. So welcome to my kitchen. Take a good look. It's never been this clean. I just did it for you today. And we're going to make some tortillas. I'm starting with 3 cups of flour, and I'm using a measuring cup. You can weigh this if you want. Flour, all-purpose flour, weighs about 4¼ ounces per cup, and I used 3 cups. But you don't really have to be that precise for this kind of dough. This is a really forgiving dough, easy to use. I'm going to add salt and baking powder. And that's the next thing you will notice anytime you start a discussion about tortillas is the pro-baking powder camp versus the anti-baking powder camp. So I'm going in now with 1 teaspoon of salt and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. So as you can see, I opted for baking powder. Lots of folks don't use it, and it makes perfectly good tortillas. I think with baking powder it's a little bit lighter. I don't notice any objectionable flavor to it, and so we're going to use some baking powder. Now the next thing we're going to do is add some lard. Oh yeah, lard. Real lard. That's the next big discussion in tortillas is lard or vegetable shortening like Crisco. Lard has a lot of flavor. Crisco doesn't have much flavor. So that's kind of end of story for me. Lard's not as good for your health probably, but probably neither of them is really great in that department anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and use the one that tastes good. So the measure on this is a 1/3 cup, but measuring a firm fat like this is very difficult to do in a little measly measuring cup like that 1/3 cup. So I did convert this to weight, and it's about 2.4 ounces. Just makes it easier to deal with. So that done, I'm going to use my hands. And this is where the fun starts. And by the way, if you have kids around and they're bored, this is a really great engaging process, and it lets them get their hands dirty, and it ends up with a dough. And kids love dough. It's just sort of this inherent great tactile thing. So I'm going to start by just mixing in the salt and the baking powder that I had put in there. And now I'm going to start breaking up the lard into pieces. And I'm putting flour on my hand to kind of help keep the lard loosened up from my fingers so I just don't get all gummed up there. And this part of distributing fat through the flour is really integral to this process. So I've got my cup of warm water, and this people get crazy about this. Some people say really hot water, some people say lukewarm water. The real purpose of this is just to not put cold water, and the reason we don't want to do that is I don't want that lard to coagulate quickly. I want it to keep distributed in the dough. So I'm putting a little bit of warm water in at a time, and I'm just using my fingers to kind of gather it and mix it in with the flour, and it's really coarse and lumpy and looks awful. That's why kids love putting their fingers in it. And it's raggedy, but it's beginning to come together, as you can see. There's some sticky parts on my hand there. This is where we start kneading, and we're going to be here for a while. Kneading and resting are the 2 keys to making a beautiful dough. If you just mix flour and water and don't knead, the gluten remains small, individually dispersed molecules. But gluten has an unusual ability to absorb water and to make connecting chains of longer molecules. Dr. Bob would probably say polymerize. And when it does that, it almost immediately starts becoming elastic in nature. So welcome back. The clock just hit 15 minutes of kneading, and you can quickly see how the dough has developed. It's much smoother, and when I pull it, it has this great elastic quality. It's like a rubber band. It pulls back at me. And all those little ridges that you're seeing there, that's perfect. That's developed gluten. Now, a few minutes ago, while I was starting this process, I mentioned that the 2 keys here are kneading to develop the gluten and resting. So the resting is the point where we let the dough begin to relax a little bit, because having built all of that gluten elasticity. If you stop and just let it rest, that elasticity softens, it relaxes. If we were to make a tortilla out of this right now, freshly kneaded and very elastic without resting, the minute it hits the hot pan, it's going to go from this to that. It will contract, becomes very tough. So we combat that by allowing this to rest. But before we rest this dough, we're going to make it into little tortilla-sized ball portions. If you have people working with you, like your kids, you can delegate some of this. And then as I have worked through the whole piece, I'll go back and make these into nice little balls. Now, if you don't feel like you want to spend this little bit of time on this step, you can shortcut this. You can roll it on the counter. You can roll it in your hands. The gist of it is to try and get a relatively smooth and uniform ball. I'm going to cover these so they don't dry out. Finish making my balls, and we'll be back in about 10 to 15 minutes of resting time for the next step. And while we're doing that, I'm going to finish the balls and I'm going to preheat the skillet. Okay, so timer's about to go off. This is a good 15-minute rest. I took advantage of the 15 minutes. There it is. And here comes the shameless commercial plug. You knew this was coming, right? Ursa Vineyards, Sierra Foothills, California. This is a grape and a wine, both named Mencía, M-E-N-C-I-A. Mencía, if you haven't discovered it yet, comes mostly originally from the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, but also a little bit in the Sierra Foothills in California. And if you're a fan of medium-bodied aromatic reds like me, this is just lovely. Think Pinot Noir, think traditional French Merlot. This is delicious and great, a little bit chilled in the summertime. And it's the trigger for the whole program we're doing today. Us wine geeks, we get so wound up in describing wine sometimes that we just border on the absurd. Some people would say went way over the border. So the other day we were talking about it and I said, you know, just as good as anything, we could just pick foods and wines that rhyme and they would probably make good matches. So what rhymes with Mencía? Tortilla. Almost perfect. So I figure if you had a glass of Mencía and a fresh tortilla and you made some chorizo and eggs or sliced some asado and put it in a fresh tortilla, a glass of Mencía would be a really lovely thing to have. So, cheers to Mencía. While you were away, my cast iron skillet is, well, you know, this is a gas burner. Same thing with electric burners. There's no way to tell you exactly how to get that perfect. You're going to play with it a little bit. And every time you make tortillas, you're going to do them a little different. So you'll use your skillet, you'll use your stove, you'll figure out the right temperature. And now that our little dough balls have rested, pretty, they're a little tacky, but not much. They're coated in lard, as I said. And we're going to start rolling them out. And at this point, we do need a little flour to help make a pretty and uniform round tortilla. So I'm flouring my hands, flouring my little rolling pin. By the way, you can use a big rolling pin. You can use one with handles and ball bearings or whatever you like. I think this is just perfect. It's the right size for my small kitchen. So I'm using my pinchers and beginning to round out this beautiful little dough. And man, see how it's not drawing back anymore? It's less elastic than it was, and it's allowing me to pinch and stretch. So that's the beginning of my circular piece. You know, these are handmade. They're not intended to look like the ones that come out of a machine. This is the real deal. And so I like seeing irregularities in any kind of food. It tells me that this is handmade stuff. Now, what did we just do? We stretched it, and that's kneading. So we're gonna let this rest before we start cooking, and there's a great way to do that. Just hang it up. Pulling it very gently and just putting it right on the comal. Now I timed this morning after I was practicing a little bit, and it seemed like 45 seconds, 50 seconds, 55 seconds. turned out pretty well. We're going to let it continue making some nice bubbles like that and rising evenly across the surface. If you can see the edges of the tortilla and you remember how thin they were when they were freshly rolled, now they're beginning to thicken up, because even though they're not huge bubbles on the edges, those little tiny microscopic bubbles of leavening are happening as the heat kicks in the second stage of the baking powder. Seeing a little bit of browning on the bottom, just about right. We're going to turn it over, and the second side, instead of being close to a minute, will be half a minute, or maybe even 45 seconds. I have a tortilla warmer here. That's a good tool if you have one. You certainly don't need it. A piece of foil works great. I have my little chicks and hens towel. I thought looked great for this today. And in she goes. Now, this is actually the last part of the cooking. In that nice, warm, dry towel, it's going to steam. And that steam finishes the cooking without drying it out, and we're ready to go with the next tortilla. These are very flexible. They're still in layers. See how the layers are puffy there? And a little bit of browning, appropriate browning, nice risen thickness on the edges. And I'm gonna bet that when we tear that apart, you'll see the lovely bread texture. So, a couple of tips. One of the things, the two things that I think I did wrong while I was learning to do this, and maybe so I can help you avoid that kind of mistake, is rolling them too thin, because I like to overdo it when I'm doing a beautiful job. Sometimes I get carried away. And the other thing is cooking them too long. And I tended to cook them too long because I don't want it to have a gummy, undercooked middle. So while I was cooking, I would let them brown a little too much. I would let them stay in the pan a little too long, hoping to cook that thin side. The big bubbly parts have steam inside. They're cooking real quickly. This part takes a little longer, and that's fine. But don't overcook them. Just till they bubble and slightly brown. And now my favorite way to eat one of these is with butter and just a little sprinkle of salt. So that's my favorite treat for doing all of this. Of course, these are best when they're fresh and warm, but if you don't want to do that, if you can't work that into your schedule, refrigerate them, wrap them well, and then reheat them gently. You can microwave them. I don't recommend it. It changes the texture of them. Oops, dropped the last one. But you can reheat them gently in the oven in a sealed container like aluminum foil with a damp paper towel. So here's to you. Make some tortillas, have a good time, drink some wine, come see us at URSA. We love you, miss you. We're still curbside right now, but as soon as we're back in action, we look forward to having a glass of wine with you. Thanks for watching.